Greetings and welcome to this week's video warm-up for the Adult Learner course. This week we're going to dig a bit deeper into one of the pillars of Knowles' andragogy concept, which is also the cornerstone of all definitions and descriptions of adult learning, and that is the idea of self-directed learning. You'll notice there are three primary objectives for the module this week. One is just to be able to recognize self-directed learning when you see it, I guess I'd say. How you can look at defining characteristics of self-directed learning and recognize it within what the learner is doing, including yourself, as well as to recognize the characteristics of an instructional design that is meant to implement and enhance self-directed learning. And in order to really engage with the topic fully, I'd like you to actually develop a self-directed learning plan for a personal goal. This is described a little bit more in the module overview, and I'll comment again on it in a couple points during the video warm-up. One of the landmark studies in adult learning was undertaken by Alan Tuff at the University of Toronto in the late 1960s and was published in 1971. Tuff and his colleagues surveyed and interviewed dozens of adults to discover the circumstances under which they learned something independent of school. He found that people undertake a wide variety of activities to better themselves in their jobs, their community lives, their family lives, or for personal enrichment, including in leisure and recreation. He called these activities learning projects, which were defined as deliberate efforts to gain certain knowledge or skill. And based on the population that he researched, Tuff found that most adults complete at least one or two learning projects per year, and on average participated in 8 of them. And he reported that on average an adult spent 700 hours per year in such learning projects. One of the off-sided conclusions of his book is perhaps best captured in his own words in a later interview. He said, "We found that 70% of learning was the individual planning their own learning. Self-directed learning is not a lonely thing. It's not an isolated thing, but a very social thing. It involves a lot of interaction with others." Keep that 70% number in mind because we'll think about it further in just a moment. And also notice that despite the prominence of the word self in the term self-directed, the Tuff viewed self-directed learning as a social activity that should bring back memories of social cognitivism and social constructivism learning theories. Charles Jennings, a current prominent business consultant in organizational learning, has found through additional research that self-directed, individually motivated, or implemented learning is commonly reported to represent 70, 75, or even as much as 80% of an individual adult's learning, especially in the workplace. About 20% of learning takes place in purposely constructed social learning circumstances, and notably it concludes that only about 10% of workforce learning occurs through formal professional development or continuing education programming. This 70-20-10 ratio isn't a fixed rule for describing workplace learning, but it forms a general framework for appreciating that human resource development must consist of more than workshops and training programs. Ideally, those of us in the HRD world have to be working with management to develop the culture of a learning organization that fosters the power of self-directed learning. Among tough subjects in the learning project study, the overwhelming dominance of learning occurred outside of classrooms or training seminars. It was learning that falls into what Miriam and Bierman described in their chapter 1 as informal learning. But it was also clear that this learning took place within a consistent structure that defines self-directed learning. So we should look more closely at how self-directed learning is defined. Recall that when Malcolm Knowles developed his concept of andragogy, which we reviewed last week, that he put the social concept of adult learners at the center of his thinking. And key to adult concept was the idea of responsibility for learning, and therefore self-directed learning. Knowles dedicated considerable effort to developing the idea of self-directed learning, including building upon Alan Tuff's work. Here is Knowles' definition. Individuals take the initiative with or without the help of others in diagnosing their learning needs, formulating learning goals, identifying human and material resources for learning, choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and evaluating those learning outcomes. Let's take a few minutes to deconstruct this definition because it contains everything that we need to know. in order to pursue our learning objectives for this week. Specifically, the definition provides a template for us to recognize when a learner is performing in a self-directed way. And the definition provides us with criteria for instructional design choices that are consistent with self-directed learning. And lastly, within this framework, you can develop your own self-directed learning plan. Perhaps the most important element of the definition of self-directed learning is that it is the learner who determines what needs to be learned. This is a conscious metacognitive act that is largely, if not entirely, independent of the influence of the teacher. Based on those needs, the learner, not a teacher or trainer, sets the learning goals for the learning project. The learner also identifies the resources they will need in order to meet their objectives. These can be material resources obtained through research, but they can also include other people. This is important because there is a commonly perpetuated myth that self-directed learning has to be a solo enterprise. Indeed, a strict reading of the term, as we mentioned earlier, implies that. But we already saw with Tufts' study, and now again here in Knowles' definition, the involvement of other people is an expected part of self-directed learning. This might include the plan to co-construct knowledge with a peer or seeking out the knowledge and advice of an expert. There is definitely a role for teachers and trainers in the self-directed learning process. The key thing for experts to remember is that they should primarily serve as consultants to the learner rather than as a teacher that sets the learning objectives and assigns a rigid learning agenda. Next, the learner outlines the learning pathway through self-regulation and learning strategies to be employed, the order of accomplishing milestones, and the timeline for completion, all of which are set by the learner. Also connected to self-regulation is the learner's ability to monitor the learning progress and to assess their own achievement of the stated goals, essential components of self-directed learning. This pathway might ring a bell in your memory with how we first examined self-direction in week 7. We noted that self-directed learners start with drawing upon motivation, entering with motivation to set the goals and commit to doing it, and task motivation to persist. In addition, the motivation interacts with metacognition that is essential for defining the learning needs, and the goals and self-regulation to monitor progress and to assess achievement. So let's quickly review these ideas in terms of the elements of a self-directed learning plan. The reflection part of your 4R this week should include the statement of such a plan for a learning project of your choosing. The first stage, which is really a critical starting point, is to figure out, using metacognition, what it is you need to learn and why you need to learn it. That then needs to be transferred and or translated into specific objectives, things that you can set up as the expectations of learning in order to achieve the expectations. Then you need to identify what you're going to need in order to meet those objectives. What materials you're going to need to locate, what people will you need to consult with. You're going to need to kick in some self-regulation. You're going to need to think about how you're actually going to use these materials and people in order to meet your objectives. You're going to need to set up a timeline and an order of pursuing each of these aspects of your learning, what kinds of milestones should be met along the way. And you're also going to need to be monitoring your learning all along, thinking about, am I getting this? Am I doing the right things? Should I be doing this differently? And ultimately, am I succeeding in meeting my objectives and my learning need? Next, I'd like to spend a few minutes exploring self-directed learning as it applies to designing learning experiences, whether for yourself as an individual or from the perspective of an instructor. Let's consider a range of approaches to teaching. The self-directed learners set their own goals and standards, with or without the help from peers and experts, are fully motivated, confident, and are self-regulated in their learning plan. At the other extreme is the dependent learner, who lacks knowledge, skills, experience, motivation, and or self-confidence to pursue learning goals, or perhaps even to set those goals. The dependent learner, therefore, depends on a teacher and direct instruction. Educational psychologist Gerald Groh constructed a useful model for teaching self-directed learning that views stages in the development of a self-directed learner from a dependent learner. The first step is to the interested learner. This is a learner who is interested in the topic or will respond to motivation, is confident of learning the material, but is not sufficiently knowledgeable to tackle the topic on his or her own. This is the person who Groh suggests most teachers would describe as being a good student. The stage before being truly self-directed is called the stage of the involved learner. These learners have some knowledge and skill, and they see themselves as active participants in their education, but they still seek some guidance and need to acquire better skills and confidence in learning from others and in locating sources of knowledge. At each stage, Groh sees a different role for the teacher. For dependent learners, the teacher is the expert authority who controls all aspects of the course or training design and transmits knowledge to the learners. At the opposite extreme, self-directed learners are best matched with a coach or consultant who only provides the guidance that is needed without obstructing the need for the learner to identify their own needs, set their own goals, pursue their own learning plan. The instructor is best seen as a source of expertise who consults the learner without making decisions. We might see the dogs in this cartoon as expressing the extremes between dependent learning and self-directed learning. I'll give you a moment to read it. In this case, the dogs are upset that they're being treated with authority while they desire to be self-directed. Groh recognizes this threat of learners who are not in the same stage that the instructor intends them to be. Groh shows the potential for consistent and inconsistent intentions of teachers and learners in the form of a matrix, with axes that represent the stages of learner progression from dependent to self-directed on the left, and the teacher's intended role from authority to consultant on the bottom. Complete congruence only exists along the diagonal in the matrix. Near matches will probably not cause significant challenges to either the instructional design or the learner's motivation and achievement, and offers the possibility of expanding the learning capacity of some students. But more significant to severe mismatches are certainly possible. When mature leaders encounter a highly structured course, they resent the inability to take the learning experience in a direction that is meaningful to them and matches their abilities to drive their own learning. And at the other extreme, a teacher or trainer may have expectations that are beyond the motivation and self-regulated learning competency of the learner. Groh continued this analysis by suggesting the types of instructional choices that different types of teachers could employ in order to successfully engage learners at each stage, knowing that there would always be a problem with the severe mismatch corners. To wrap up, I'd just like to point that I'm dealing with these issues right now in my role as a teaching professional development dean at the UNM Med School. Our MD degree program will go up for accreditation in 2 years. New standards which apply to our accreditation were just recently released. These standards state an expectation for self-directed learning, as written here. Most of the faculty are unsure about what this term, self-directed learning, means and what the accreditation standard really means. It's my job to help them develop instructional designs and curricula that match the expectations of our accreditor. On the other hand, we perceive that most of the students are mostly concerned about faculty delivering the vast amounts of content knowledge that are included on the board exams that they must perform well on after their second year of med school. They are motivated to pass the test, not to be lifelong learners. So I also need to help faculty develop strategies for broadening the motivation of the students. It's a very challenging pair of problems to simultaneously address. So that wraps up the video warm-up for this week's topic. as you reflect and research and pursue mastery of the learning objectives stated in the overview for the week, here's some other things you might keep in mind. For instance, when have you engaged in a learning project as a self-directed learner? As well as thinking about various learning experiences in and out of formal education, can you determine stages of Grow's scheme, going from dependent to self-directed, that you have pursued in the past or current learning experiences? And don't forget the expectation in your 4R this week to generate a self-directed learning plan for a learning goal that you have. This doesn't need to be pages of text, but simply to identify something that you feel you need to know, whether it relates to you personally, professionally, or academically. Perhaps thinking forward to your putting it together project in this course or something you're working on in another class. I look forward to reading your 4Rs this week. Adios.